Teaching is hard, and oftentimes it isn't what happens in the classroom that makes the job difficult. It's what happens before and after school, during passing periods, at lunch, in meetings, or in our lives outside of school that challenges our ability to stick with the profession. TeacherGuard is committed to focusing on making teaching sustainable and enjoyable. We want to make the rewards of the profession seem more attainable and the challenges more bearable. Our mentorship model pairs teachers with consistent daily support from a peer educator. Through TeacherGuard's four sustainability principles, we will walk the challenging times with you and allow you to enjoy the wins and celebrations that come with this beautiful profession. See teacherguard.net for more information and to explore how you can join our community of educators today. We hope you enjoy today's podcast. All right, welcome back. Joining me today, thank you so much for the time that you're giving me here. We have Jeff Spencer. How you doing, Jeff?
Doing pretty good. How are you doing tonight?
I am great. Let's start off by just having you talk a little about kind of your career trajectory, how you started in the classroom and how you got all the way to what you're doing right now.
Awesome. Great. So as a formal introduction, yeah, my name's Jeff Spencer. I am currently a science instructional coach for the Regional Office of Education System of Illinois. And so a lot of my role right now is working with districts from a systems perspective to build support structures around science teachers, particularly to help them understand what their standards are, help them make sense of different curricular resources and moves that they can make, and then also building systems around them so that when they choose an innovation, they are able to be successful and enact it with support and what that looks like. And so I love what I do, but it's one of those things that I feel like I haven't been in this spot my entire career. And so, yeah, I started in the classroom maybe about 15 years ago. Wow, I'm getting old now, right? And
We
yeah,
all are.
right around the time that the next generation science standards came out. And I was part of the cohort of teachers that was like the new standards dropped and very little resources were out there. And so we had to design everything from scratch and or think, beg, steal, and borrow. And so I worked out in Aurora, Colorado, and I loved it, every moment of it. It was a district that was very diverse, both in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of culture. It was one of those things that me being a white male from a rural community, there's a lot of barriers that I ran into just from cultural differences that I had to learn about. And so I went to University of Illinois, go Illini. We got to the Final Four. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. And so it was one of those things that I came from a really good chemistry department. And I thought that, just an excitement for chemistry and knowing my stuff, that was good enough. And man, did not recognize my privilege in that entire process, right? And so I went to Colorado just because in Illinois, the teacher retirement system wasn't great. And they shifted to a different retirement system. And I wanted to retire before the age of 80 and or whatever age it is. And I don't know if I'm ever going to retire.
So ambitious, Jeff.
I know, right? This is great. And I joined a school that was a pilot school for the next generation science standards. And basically we were able to prove that it met or exceeded Colorado state standards. And so we had autonomy in our classrooms to learn and do what we wanted. And so it was great because we had freedom, but it was bad because we had freedom. And we had to do a lot of innovative and creative things with a population that traditionally is fairly difficult. Couple that with the fact that Colorado is a right to work state and the unions weren't strong. And so I taught class sizes between 30 and 40 for every one of my classes. Yeah. And so I being the person that I am and similar to you, Adam, like I worked my tail off and I did as much professional learning as I possibly could, learn about a lot of high quality resources, including things like problem-based learning and tried to apply those principles as best as possible. But I kept running into these cultural barriers insofar as like, yes, there's a resource debt there that a lot of students, like we have a lot of work to do in order to make up what we owe to those populations. But I also, some of the cultural stuff of like, okay, so people were telling me to be culturally relevant, but in science, there's almost no resources to be culturally relevant. So over time, and after some pretty difficult transitions in my school when it came to administration, I decided to make a pivot and shift to go and become a grad student. So putting my feelers out, I went and was able to get a PhD at University of Michigan. Go Blue! We won the national title. So
You are all over the Final Four. Yeah,
it was awesome. I was hoping that I'd have two Big Ten teams facing each other. Right, that would have been great.
great.
Yeah. And so there it was fantastic, and I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. And not only was I able to get a very interdisciplinary degree, both in chemistry and education, but I was able to do a project where I partnered with indigenous communities up in northern Alaska to really look at that question of cultural relevance and what does that look like. And over the course of 6 years, we worked together with the indigenous community to build a science curriculum that both embodied Western science and traditional ways of knowing, and based off of the community perspectives that they bring. And a lot of that work, especially learned to unpack my identity and talk a lot about power and consider power, and resources and what that all means and colonization and some very uncomfortable and difficult topics. But it also helped me understand like what it actually takes to develop and design curricular resources that are actually relevant for students' lives, and what it takes to as a curriculum goes from research to practice, what types of adaptations have to be made in order for it to be successful. And so I found myself like actually it was on a bike ride. We'd moved to Central Illinois because the COVID happened and I had a young family. And I was on a bike ride with a friend, and she was a math coach for the region. And she was like, yeah, like I do this math coaching stuff. She described her job supporting teachers. I'm like, whoa, that's actually very similar to a lot of stuff that I was doing in graduate school. And so we talked, and she's like, dude, you need to meet my boss. And I just had a quick conversation with the boss, and I randomly happened upon a job that is currently what I do today. And so, yeah, at this point, I've expanded beyond Illinois. I have about 3 dozen districts on my caseload and around 60,000 students. I do a lot of like, I was at a district today that normally has an attrition rate of 30 to 35%. And they were telling me that only one teacher resigned this year. And it was
Whoa.
and we've been working with them for 5 years, and such a huge celebration with that district.
I mean, this is one of the big reasons why I wanted to have you on, Jeff, just because I think what you do uh, as a full-time job is essentially, it's content related naturally, but you're keeping teachers in the classroom. And I wonder, obviously the culturally responsive teaching is really important for students, but I wonder how much, if not more important, it is for keeping teachers in that profession. And so, thinking about the work that you're doing, your learnings, and the work that you continue doing on a daily basis, what would you consider, based on what you've seen, to be one, maybe two factors that if you could eliminate those, more teachers would remain in the profession?
Ooh, that is a complicated question. And it's something that, like, yeah, you asked about that. I've been thinking about that a little bit. And I think, firstly, the first biggest factor is that I think we need to elevate the professionalism of teaching. I think that's on the face of administration, but that's also on the face of teachers themselves and of as a society. And in so many ways, especially in science, a lot of teachers have never been trained on their standards before.
Mhm,
Like, that's really important to sit with, right? Like, if we were architects working with, or if I was working with an architect and it said, I don't know my code, or I just don't believe in that code, I'm just not going to follow it. That's a load bearing wall. I'm just going to ignore that. That architect would not have a job. But then the architect also gets the professional learning paid for. They go to conferences. They have a lot of creative liberties because they themselves embrace the professionalism of their profession. And
mhm,
so for me, like, I take that with me every single day, insofar as recognizing that, like, a lot of teachers, the structures around them are what's keeping them like constrained within a system. And that system can be very demoralizing and very demeaning. But a lot of that system as well has been created by factors that most people within the system have no idea why they're created in the first place. And it's like, oh, why do we do it this way? Oh, it's because 3 admin ago, some person did this,
yeah,
and that just wrecked everything. And then there's this residual like trauma that teachers have. So it takes sitting with them and saying, first of all, that sucks that that happened, affirming that. And then two, saying, okay, so that happened. Now what? What's a structure that we can build? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, yeah, you have agency here because you're a professional, and professionals take agency, like use evidence-based resources to take agency of the situations. And in a lot of ways, at first they feel scared. Sometimes they feel frustrated and angry that I call them out sometimes on that stuff. But in the end, as we establish a collective and collaborative norm, like just agreements that we work together and how we operate, oftentimes teachers will come around to it and be like, you know what, like, yeah, if I can back up my decisions based off of student data, most of the time my admin's never going to disagree with me. In fact, they're going to view me as a leader because I do that. And that's really empowering for a lot of teachers.
What you bring up came up in another conversation that I had recently, and it was surrounding the idea of, in other high stakes professions that we have out there, it takes n- nearly a decade, if not more, to be a doctor, right? A physician.
Yep.
It takes years and years to be a lawyer, tons of examination. At least in California, which is where I got into my profession, it takes less than a year to get a teaching credential. And then after that, your professional development is on you to seek out if you want additional or to just lean on whatever your school provides. That can't be right, right? That there's no way that in a year we can be professional teachers.
Right. And we've created this system, right? That's like if we were doctors, we're inventing the technique on the patient as we're operating on them. And we're having to pay for our scalpels. And then we would never go to a doctor like that. Why am I sending my children to that? You know? And that's one of those things that like I think about that. I'm like, oh my goodness. And again, that's nothing to do like I think most people in the system, like they're not the problem. It's the system itself that's the problem. And it takes someone going and questioning why are we doing what we're doing to make that shift around a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, volume might be the answer for why that system is the way it is, right? You probably need way more teachers than you need some of these other professions, and so you can afford a longer on-ramp to gaining or to getting into that field. But that doesn't mean that just because you can be credentialed to be a teacher, that there shouldn't be some kind of continuous requirement for your own professional growth.
Or I think it's really interesting when you look at research funds, so much of the research funds in this country for teacher education go towards pre-service teachers. And it's one of those things that we trained up these really young and zealous teachers that are really excited about these new and novel way of teaching, if they're lucky and in a good program. And then they go to the in-service teaching realm where there's very little support for them. And oftentimes it's like, I think the mantra at universities is like, oh, if we train them, then the system will eventually change. But what we're doing is we're sending some of our most inexperienced, but yet brightest and really excited people to the front lines. And basically they're crashing against the wall that is the institution. And so for me, a lot of the work that I do is saying we need to take funds, we need to take resources and use them to actually like support in-service teachers beyond just what the school can provide.
Well, and as a new teacher, uh, you don't know what you need, right? You don't know the things you're going to face in those first couple of years, especially when you're so used to in your credentialing program. Maybe you were with a cohort of other teachers and professors who are consistently talking about the same challenges that you're facing every day. And all of a sudden, from one year to the next, you're stripped of that. And so you don't know what's coming around the corner. And so how are you going to seek out support for obstacles that you don't know are coming next week?
Yep. I think that that's also part of the problem. I think that's part of the professionalism, right? There is not an induction program or mentorship program outside of what the district provides. And oftentimes that's not usually with the best teacher that's most excited to do that. It's just what's convenient, right? And I think for me, it's bonkers that I am in a state that was one of the first states for the NGSS. We were part of the states that wrote the NGSS, and yet there's no infrastructure to teach people how to use the NGSS well.
Thinking about that and thinking about the work that you did in graduate school, right? And we can get to the principles later here, but I'm really curious about what do you feel changed in your approach to your profession? Or what do you feel changed the most prior to and after that experience you shared? Because it feels like you became a different teacher, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
totally.
I wonder how many of our teachers who are on the verge of, maybe I'm done with the profession, their world would change with an experience like this. So, what would you say was your biggest lesson?
I think for me, and as positioned as a white male working with indigenous folks, it's learning about the effects of colonization. And then for me, in my process, looking at what colonist entities and non-colonist entities getting at the same table and looking at power dynamics. It was fascinating to me to see that, like, when you get town elders for the Inupiaq people up in Alaska, together with whaling captains, with scientists, with education researchers, there's all of these different power dynamics at play. It was fascinating for a couple of reasons. One of which is like coming from Ann Arbor and then going up to northern Alaska, the time is just different up there. And it took multiple days of me almost detoxing from like being in university land to being like in a place that's like, we'll get to it when we get to it because it's minus 40 degrees outside and they just caught a whale. Like it's different,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
And so when I saw that and started thinking about like, okay, and one of my last chapter of my dissertation, my committee wanted me to reflect on the power dynamics. So I was able to name a lot of things that I really struggled with, which is like there was a time that we gave the scientists more privilege than the elders, and this was by design because if the scientists didn't get that perspective, get that elevated perspective, then they wouldn't have been involved with our project. And I'm like, as I started thinking about that, working with teachers, I'm like sitting at a design table around an implementation plan. And all of a sudden, there's this really, really strong science teacher that's like, I won't do it unless it's X, Y, and Z, and almost holding everyone hostage. I'm like, wait a second. This is the same type of a dynamic that was going on where people were using their power and their position in order to make certain things not make certain voices not be heard. And so then I started developing a series of tools to help like mitigate power imbalances at the design table. And so for me and part of some of my projects, I oftentimes will get district leaders with teachers, with students, with community members all together at the same table to come up with a vision for what they want for their district and their school. And that's one of the most powerful moments because at those moments, they viewed like a superintendent who's almost untouchable before that point. You cede their power to everyone else so they could listen in on the discussion of what's actually happening in their districts. And then from there, like, yes, their voice matters and is part of the design constraint. But then when a parent's like, I really care about this, and teachers like, I do too, and superintendent's like, oh, we actually have money for that. And then there's all of a sudden these synergistic juices start flowing that would never have existed if those power dynamics were never called out in the first place. And so, yes, I shifted in my facilitation and in my teaching in those eras. But I think for me, the biggest like visor that I put on, or the glasses that I put on, was this idea of seeing systems as place things that protect certain people with specific powers. And so, if we were to kind of shift some of those bounds a little bit, how can we give teachers their voices back so we could actually have them make decisions for their classroom?
You're making me think of something I experienced when I was in the classroom because I taught in a border city, right? So San Diego, California is where I started my career. And I think back to this experience that I had with a student who got a question wrong on an exam. And the question, it was a word problem and it was contextualized around dinner time. And this student, I eventually found out, was so hung up on I couldn't even get to solving the question because I was so confused by the fact that they were having dinner at 5 p.m. When in my household, one, we don't get together for dinner. And if we do, because my parents are working different hours, because I have to take care of my siblings. And if we do, it's a little snack at 8 or 9 p.m. That question moved that student's grade from an A to a B in that particular high stakes class. Just that question alone, right? So let's just assume that. So what are all the consequences of just that one question that was not necessarily a culturally responsive question to be added there, that then changed the student's grade, which then affected their GPA, which then affected their potential scholarship and college opportunities. Obviously, I'm reducing it to saying that one question. It could have been any question on the exam, but the correct answer is that it shouldn't have been any question on the exam, right?
Right, right,
And
right.
and so that's where what you're saying resonates with me so much, and I want to keep talking about it because you think about being aware of culture and thinking of these large systems, but this is an example where like you can get down to the nitty-gritty of one moment in one classroom that changed the life.
Right. And the fact that this is teaching is a human endeavor. And when we systematize things, we inherently dehumanize the system, the whole process. And it's one of those things, and I see it in science classrooms all the time, where it's like a great example would be something like electron configuration. Adam, do you know what electron configuration is? Okay, cool. A lot of people don't, and they're successful people, right? It's the idea of 1s2, 2p, 2s2, 2p6, and that's X element, right? Um, and when I start asking, it's not in the NGSS. A lot of chemistry teachers are really struggling with that. And I ask them the question, why do you struggle with that? And they're like, well, this is just an important part of chemistry. And I'm like, okay, so what is an electron configuration anyways? And like, well, it's the position on the periodic table. Oh, it's the where the electrons are arranged around the atom. I'm like, okay, those are heuristics, right? And that helps us play battleship with the periodic table, and that's fine. But those are quantum numbers that are placed in probability wave functions. They're probabilities in wave functions, which are really complex equations that take multivariable calculus to do. I remember taking my PChem class, and like after years of calculus, I could get it, but only to like it was a trauma. But I love the theory, but it's trauma, right? And I asked the question, why are we teaching students this? What's the point of this? And when you start asking the question, what's the point of any of this? All of a sudden, like the rose-colored glasses gets knocked off, and you realize most of the stuff that we teach, we have no reason why we're teaching it in the first place. Or if we can explain why we're teaching it, oftentimes it's so disconnected from the students that they either don't buy it, or they've been so conditioned within the system. They're like, all right, Dr. Spencer, just tell me how high to jump.
Hmm.
Stop, enough with this culture mumbo jumbo. I just want to know what the right answer is. And that response is a conditioned response because we built a system around that particular perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I heard a different podcast recently talking about how, I think one of the things you learn in early elementary school when you start learning multiplication is this idea of a negative times a negative is a positive, right? If you were to tell me you'll give me $1 million to explain why that's the case right now, I would lose out on $1 million. I can't tell you why a negative times a negative is a positive, nor can I tell you why knowing that information that I repeated thousands of times matters in my life right now or in the life of
Mhm.
people that are way more successful than me. And yet it is something that our elementary school kids nationwide have to know. Uh, why? Like in what way does that improve their problem solving skills, their ability to do difficult things? Uh,
Yeah.
It doesn't,
And it's one of
right?
those things that for me, yeah, it doesn't. And if we focus so much on that content and not on the practices of math or science and like what are the tools in a toolkit that we can use to make sense of the world around us, in so many ways we've just missed the point. And it's right. And it's like it's funny because like one of the curricular resources that I'm involved with and do work with, they teach chemistry through an environmental science lens. So it's not just thermodynamics using styrofoam cups and the little the thermometer thing. Like they're actually studying glacial melts in the Arctic, and they're looking at
Mm.
how it affects sea level rise. And it's interesting because when I teach that to chemistry teachers, their very first reaction is like, "Well, that's just not chemistry. This is evidence-based science." I'm like, "This is they actually like derive equations that people in AP chemistry derive using data. How is this not chemistry?" And they're like, "Well, it doesn't have these labs, or it doesn't look and feel and act like science the way that I experienced it." And I could go down like the identity pieces of like, well, I'm an environmental chemist. I did work up in the Arctic. Like, does that make me not a chemist? And like, well, what you did was chemistry, but what they're doing is not chemistry. And I will go down to down to my grave by saying, like, we are teaching a very specific view of what science is. And as long as we have such a narrow view, we're going to have students who basically recognize that we've created this shitty game called school, and basically it's based off of these series of arbitrary points that we've just kind of like made up on our own, but we have this false perspective of what truth is, and therefore we're just trying to, and like this is no different than what we did to indigenous people in boarding schools, but on a systemic level. And it
Well, and
horrifies me. So
and it's why so many people are afraid of AI, right? School districts are coming up with board policies for what to do with this problem that is causing all this cheating. And the way I see it, if a student can use AI to answer a question that you pose to them, your question isn't good enough. Right. And
yes,
because all we're doing is asking for information regurgitation, which they could do it before AI was as sophisticated as it was today, simply when Google came out 20 years ago, So we're so afraid of something that I think, to your point, is challenging the system of education that we've worked so hard to create.
we are in a tremendous disrupting system right now, of like
Yeah.
era right now to the system. And so much of it, you're right. It's because AI is challenging that, because I say that all the time. We're asking the wrong questions if AI can answer it on a dime, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like you look at the problems that the world is trying to solve right now, climate change, poverty, these things are not something that AI can just solve on a dime. Like these are what's called wicked problems, things that are going to take our generation at least to figure out if we work together and have the right policies and yada, 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 right? Um, and so So if we're just asking students to regurgitate information, no wonder they're getting out into the real world and they're like, I struggle with the view of science. I don't know if I agree with the view of science. Or like you look at COVID and they're like masks on, masks off. Wait a second, is CDC lying to us because they keep
Yeah.
changing their mind? That's half the population's thinking about that, whereas the other half of the population is like, no, they're just responding to data. And that creates these epistemological divides, these worldview divides that cause us not to be able to interface with one another. And it's happening everywhere in society right now. And I think that that falls squarely in the classroom. That's the cause.
It's that idea of like there needs to be a definitive answer for everything, right? And so either something is good or something is bad, either something is right or something is wrong, because that's what our education system has taught us. And when the folks who are in their 30s and 40s right now, who went through the same education system that you and I did, are running into the situation where you're realizing it isn't that clear. There could be something that you think today that it's perfectly fine to think the opposite way tomorrow. It jars us, right? And so, you know who doesn't think that way? Are the kids that are in school right now. I think they are of the mindset of like, I am open to anything because I don't know what is true and what is not, you know?
Right. Right. And I think for me, like one of the things I love to do with teachers, like, and we're doing this at the regional level with where I'm at, is creating these design teams to find out, to build resources that connect with issues with the community. So in Central Illinois, like if you've ever seen Blues Brothers, it's the one that's like, chicken wire. We have both types of music, country and Western. It's like super deep red down here in many places. And like back when certain political tides occurred, like I lost a few contracts because I'm associated with DEI work, even though I was doing good work in those small communities, but they couldn't have someone associated with DEI being present in their schools because of school board races and stuff. It was shocking. And so I started some work connecting people together. And like down here, there's a lot of like solar panel farms. There's a lot of wind turbines going up everywhere. Like if you fly over Central Illinois, you'll see blinking red lights as far as the eye can see, because a lot of farmers have actually embraced renewable energies in many ways, which is interesting because you don't hear that narrative. And so me and a few friends got together and like, what happens if we put a farmer, and this started with some teachers as well. What happens if we put a farmer, some climate scientists, and some engineers at like Rivian, which is like a EV company out of Bloomington Normal, which is like a Central Illinois town. And let's get them together and let's design curricular resources that are interesting to the people of their communities. Because like you go to a wind turbine farms being established in the area, and there's engineers talking and farmers talking, and they're on like two different wavelengths because you don't even know how to, like one's talking high science and the other one's talking about like what's going on with the weather. And they're scientific, it's just different views of science, right? And so we've been designing these resources that are like, okay, so what happens if we're going to install a solar panel field, a farm in this field? How much CO2 is actually offset? How much is that going to cost? How much energy is going to be put out of production? And they start thinking about the problem as if they were citizens. And they propose ideas and solutions for the communities, right? And you look at that, and students want to engage in that on that level because that's the stuff that matters in their everyday lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can never ask, when are we going to use this? Because you are using it as you are generating knowledge and information about what's happening, because it's based on what you see in
Right.
your world.
And it's about multiple perspectives and being affirming, right? My job as a teacher is not to tell them that solar panels are bad or good. My job as a teacher is to facilitate discussion where multiple perspectives can be woven together, then use data to back up their claims on why they're doing it, which is what,
Yeah.
go ahead, which is what society needs. If we're not doing this in classrooms, where are they getting it?
Yeah. Yeah. When you were talking about, the challenges that you have with boards that are, yeah, I don't know, intentionally or maybe constrained by parents, PTAs, whatever, um, that ultimately make decisions that affect the type of professional development that either keeps or doesn't keep our teachers in the classroom. I am embarrassed to say that I recently found out, or heard on a different podcast, a little snippet about Brown versus Board of Education, right? And when you think of that, you think of great, right? Integration. Students were able to go to schools that they weren't able to go to before. What I didn't know is that they integrated the students, but they didn't integrate the staff right away. And so
Yeah.
you had students that were all of a sudden, the world was thinking, or certain aspects of the world were thinking like this is a great thing. But you had frightened students who were being taught by people that they had never interacted with before in that
Yeah.
kind of manner.
And to interject with that, at Michigan. Got lunch with a lot of black friends after seminar classes and things like that. And one of them was talking about just that, like, oh, like, and for me, I've always heard Brown versus Board of Education, good,
Yeah,
desegregation, good, and all of a sudden I hear them talking poorly about this, my friends, and I'm just gonna check myself. You're talking poorly. I've always viewed it as good. What's going on? They're like, that's because we never asked to be a part of your system. We asked for the resources to teach our kids in the ways that we
right.
want to teach them.
Exactly.
And that just
Yeah,
like
and so
sunk in, you know?
but it's crazy to think that, like, we've lived however old we are, um, thinking this particular way, right? And I find myself as I get older, I think about how many things am I going to negotiate in terms of my beliefs, right? Like, at what point am I going to get to a point where I'm a, grumpy old man that just is not going to change what he thinks? Um, and it's crazy to think that's something that you've always perceived in a certain way. You now have to, again, negotiate with what you're going to think about that. And that happens on a daily basis with decisions that get made by our school boards that affect our teachers and their ability to not just teach, but to remain in the profession.
Right. I think for me, one of the big things that I think you asked for turning points is when I realized like that not everything, like in science, you get trained up to try to find the objective capital T truth, right? If you hold all the variables constant except one, you can figure out how that molecule moves in very specific ways. But then when I got into education, especially as I started studying cultural relevance, I realized it's not what is truth, it's whose truth are we representing and why.
Yeah. And how quickly are we getting the answer, right? This is another example that I'm going to share because it matters here. And this is twice that I've referenced this, so I'm just going to say the podcast name. It's Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History, if you've ever heard of
Sweet.
it.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
love that podcast. And I went back and I'm starting to listen from season one. And then one of the episodes had to do with how to become a lawyer, right? The guy's Canadian. And he's talking about how in order to become a lawyer in the US, you have to pass an exam, right? And that exam has multiple sections in which you're timed. That's not the case in Canada. And so what he's saying is this idea of, like, we don't just reward the people that are able to arrive at the right answer at any given time. We reward the people that are able to do it the fastest. He also used chess as an example, right? Like, we don't just want to see people play chess and think about their moves. We want them to do it quickly because that's what we value.
Yeah.
Uh, and maybe when we look at how our education systems are doing compared to other countries, maybe we have to reevaluate that.
Right. And so much of the work that I do, one of my first conversations I have with the admin is saying, research shows that any innovation is going to take 3 to 5 years of sustained support. If you're expecting me to give a one and done PL, that model is broken. There's no data that backs it up. And if there's no support system around that teacher, it's going to fail. And we're just pissing away resources by doing that. And what happens is we'll do something like standards-based grading is the way to go and it's the coolest thing in the world. And then as a district, they'll go behind it. And then a year later, it's like, oh no, we're switching to problem-based learning. And everyone does problem-based learning, but all the good work that teachers did gets replaced. And I call that toil, that systemic toil, right? And so much of my job as a coach is to be like, yes, PBL is really good, but you guys actually agreed to standards-based grading. We're just beginning this. And so you guys can go do PBL, but we as a science team, we're going to continue doing standard-based grading and we're going to do it really well. And I might piss off some admin, but at the end of the day, it helps keep teachers in the classroom. And like this, like, I feel like it's like Doug the dog from Up, where it's like admin are like squirrel, like they go and they try to find the next big thing. If they're like, I always tell my teachers, like, look, if I'm telling you that I know what the right answer is, you chase me out of this building with a pitchfork, because if there was a right answer, we would have found it by now. But how much money goes into our education system?
Well, and I often I think about how would our education system look if we didn't pay our administrators more than we pay our teachers, even if we just paid them the same amount, right? One, I feel like nobody would want to go into administration, but then the folks that do might feel like they have less to lose, right? Because why is so much of what we do from a professional development standpoint a dog and pony show? It's because administrators are governed by board meeting schedules and they have to present to these other stakeholders, what's happening. And they don't want to go month after month repeating the same thing. Hey, we're still refining this. Hey, we're still. So we got to find the new flashy thing. And whether we're doing that with fidelity or not, it gets me through another board meeting, making it seem like we're trying something really nice, right? It isn't deceptive necessarily, but it is harmful to not stick with something long term because you're potentially losing out on something great.
Right. One, I think you hit the nail, and I'll go back to the professionalism thing again, right? What profession do we go and try to find the next big thing over and over and over and over and over again without like if we're investing $100,000 in something, we're the next year we're not going to jump pivot to something different. That's just bad business, right? And then another thing about the professionalism is that like we teachers collectively need to make more money. Like it's kind of crazy to think about like the average teacher salary and what it takes to raise a family in this country in most places. And it's sad to me to hear about places like California building apartment complexes for teachers to live in their districts. When it's like, okay, why can't we just take that money and actually pay teachers a living wage?
Yeah, and again, I mean, you think about some of the biggest cities, right? Thinking just in California, a city like Inglewood, right? It's one of the biggest cities and one of the most expensive cities to live in. Also, one of the cities where students need good teachers the most because of the challenges that are associated with some of those areas. And so you need, in order to get good teachers there, you need one, to have somebody that's willing to live there, to have somebody that's making really good money, and to have somebody that's willing to stay there for a good period of time. That is a tough combination to get good teachers in front of these students, right? And the good teachers that are there, because there are a lot, they are struggling to make ends meet.
Mhm.
Right.
Yes.
And so what's the answer? Like, well, you don't have to live in California. Okay, well, if I leave, then my students don't have good teachers anymore. Right. That may not be the only reason I'm staying, but that doesn't solve the bigger issue that we have.
I think for me, it was very eye-opening. The school that I taught in had an Air Force base in its catchment, right? So there's an Air Force base that was there. And my fifth year, as I was teaching, I was like walking into the building. I saw a couple F-18s like flying overhead, and I'm like, one of those costs as much as this new building. Wait, that training run that costs as much as my salary probably. And they do it every single morning, and there's three of those planes. And I look at churches who get tax exempt status, but and they're sending missionaries to Ethiopia, but yet my students, I have 40 kids in every one of my classes, and they're not getting meals, and like their basic needs are not being met. And so for me, that communicated a greater mismatch in priorities. And I'm just going to lay it out flatly. I don't think we prioritize children in this country. I think we see it with gun reforms. I think we see it with how communities spend their dollars. I think it's how we treat teachers. And it's one of those things that until we make that shift collectively as a society, that we care about these things. And going back to the doctor's analogy, it's like if doctors got paid what teachers got paid, they wouldn't be in the profession anymore. Like, and it feels silly to even consider that, right?
No, but you're right. It's not an issue of how much is in the pot. It's how our allocations being made, right? And look at all any board meeting agenda for any district. They're all public. You will pull a random one and you will find some decisions on there that are insane,
I
right?
mean, I'll even look at things like Chromebooks. One-to-one Chromebooks were all the rage in the past decade, especially with ESSER funds and COVID and everything like
Hmm.
that. But the data is showing that it has little to no effect on students and their learning. In fact, there's more data to show that they're distractors. So we're thinking how much money was spent, and so much of it was actually like when it's all said and done, we're just getting students addicted to the Google Suite. Wait, isn't that beneficial to just Google? So why aren't we questioning this as teachers, right? Why is it that if I'm a teacher that wants to do analog and hands-on activities, I get critique because I don't have Schoology on my Chromebooks?
Yeah, and the reason is because if I'm part of a school board, I want to hear that you're bringing a 1-to-1 ratio of Chromebook to students, right? And so
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
it's a mixture of who is on our boards to begin with. Are they folks that were educators in the past? A lot of the times it's not. On top of that, who are the administrators that are ultimately making some of these decisions? And then
yep,
again, where is the teacher voice in all of this
bingo. Hmm.
that ultimately dictates our education system and sustainability?
Yeah.
Um, this is a great conversation, Jeff. I really appreciate where this went because I think there's some items here that for sure I haven't touched in any of the other podcasts and that I don't think many people chat about. So Thank you again for joining me. I like to finish this by always asking folks who have been teachers for a while, if you were in a room with a teacher who's in their third or fourth year and you only had one or two sentences to share with them because they're on the verge of leaving the profession, what would it be?
Take care of yourself by setting boundaries and never lose sight of the fact that teaching is a human enterprise. Your students, your fellow teachers, your admin are human beings. So keep things based on relationships.
Awesome. There you have it. Thank you, Jeff Spencer. Appreciate you, man.
Yep, of course. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it and found it helpful to your teaching journey, please don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube or through your favorite podcast platform. We also appreciate any and all reviews or comments you leave. Thank you for joining us today and tune in next week for our next episode.